The British Army could be destroyed in 6 months if war broke out. That's according to the Veterans Minister. Colonel Alastair Cairns said the Army needs to rethink how it uses reservists in the event of a crisis. As it stands, the Army has the fewest number of soldiers since the Napoleonic Wars. Larisa Brown is the defence editor for The Times, wrote this piece for the paper and joins me now in the studio. Hello, Larisa.
Hello.
It's good to see you. Are we hearing now that the British military, Larisa, is just not fit for purpose?
I think the point that he was making is that if you look at the manpower element to all of this, we've got an army that is 72,000 strong, and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, has warned that it's going to dip below 70,000 next year. And then you're seeing in, on the Ukrainian battlefield, 1,500 Russians being killed every day, which is obviously extraordinary. So actually, I thought that he was kind of optimistic to say that the army would survive 6 months, because if you look at the figures, they'd probably do well to do that, actually. So I mean, it was pretty candid remarks from him, and I think it did surprise quite a few people. But yes, as I said, I thought he was being optimistic.
It is eye-popping stuff, Larisa, coming from a serving government minister. I mean, who's the audience for this? Is he talking, through you to Downing Street? Is he talking to the Treasury? Is he talking to his own department? Because this can't be easy to hear.
The audience, we were speaking, we were at this RUSI event in Whitehall, and it was full of actually quite senior military officers, as well as some former politicians. They were in the room, and think tanks and journalists. So he knew that he was speaking to journalists, and I think we were all pretty taken aback that he was able to be quite frank.
Is it meant for the ears of the Prime Minister there, or the Chancellor? Is it about resources or about organisation?
Well, he was saying that you didn't necessarily need to increase the size of the army. What you needed to do is actually enhance the reserve forces and make sure that they're ready to fight. And you also know where all of these people are. And something that we've explored previously is the fact that if you leave the military, so you're a veteran, you have this thing called a reserve liability, which means that you could be called up to fight in a war up to 18 years after you've left. But the problem is the army doesn't know where many of these people are, and there's potentially up to 70,000 of them. So one thing that the army is actually trying to do is to try and find all these veterans who could be called up to fight in a war, but they're struggling to do so. So I think one of the things he's talking about is the fact that we need to know where all of these people are, and we need to use the reserve force properly, because in the time of war, 70,000 troops in the regular army are not going to be enough.
It's quite an operation by the sound of that, finding all these former service people who are out there thinking that they're free of their time in uniform, and then tapping them up and telling them you might be needed. Your country may need you.
Yeah, and in reality, how many of those are going to come forward if we're faced with a war with Russia, where we're having to sort of throw people into the battlefield and tens of thousands of them are dying?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the truth is also, Larisa, isn't it, that if it came to it, combat with Russia, Britain would not be fighting alone under any surely conceivable scenario.
No, and that's the point that obviously people like Cairns will often make, is that obviously we would fight as a NATO force. We'd be able to draw upon the American military, but of course now everyone's thinking about what would we do if America becomes more isolationist. We've got Donald Trump coming in the White House in January, and European allies are going to have to do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to Europe, as the US focus on the Indo-Pacific region.
Does this country, Larisa, because you talk to these commanders from across the spectrum, does Britain's NATO partners, do they feel that Britain's pulling its weight?
I've had private conversations with some Americans. They definitely think that our army's way too small. And actually, I've spoken to European military chiefs who have privately, also, they've not wanted to go on record, but they've also privately voiced concerns that we aren't doing enough. And so I think generally we might, people are hoping that we're going to become, a leading nation when it comes to arming Ukraine going forward. But actually, we haven't got the resources to do that at the moment. And there's no sign of the government announcing when we're going to hit that 2.5% spending on defence.
Right. I mean, do stick with us if you can, Larisa, for a little longer. Have a listen to this. This is Lord Richards, General Lord Richards, former Chief of the Defence Staff, talking to Times Radio Breakfast. He made a point. The UK should not, at the very early stage of this war, have encouraged Ukraine to keep on fighting.
I felt that we had underestimated Russia's resolve and the fact that for Russia it is an existential issue, the status of Ukraine, and it clearly is for Ukraine, but it never has been for the West. So what we've done, sadly, is encourage them over the last over 2 years to carry on fighting without ever giving the very brave people in question the means to win. And so I feel slightly and sadly like a prophet without honor in my own land, because I felt there was a moment back in 22 when Ukraine was, if you like, at its high water mark, when they should have negotiated, but they were encouraged not to and persuaded to carry on fighting.
This is remarkably strong stuff from the man who was basically the head of the British military, all services. I want to get the thoughts now of Alexander Kara, director of the Ukrainian think tank Center for Defense Strategies and an advisor previously to the Minister of Defense in Ukraine. Hello to you, Alexander.
Good evening.
What do you say, Alexander, to what you've heard there from General Lord Richards?
Well, first of all, he could not be more wrong on two things. First, that Boris Johnson or whoever else from the UK discouraged Ukraine, or they just broke the so-called peace initiative from the Russian side. So Ukraine was ready to fight for its survival, even with Ukrainian arms and with bit American arms. I would say that in 2022, prior to the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, we had just javelins and a bit of stingers that American provided us with. So we were ready to fight for our survival with Ukrainian and Soviet-made weapons, because we know that Russia decided to eliminate Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian as a nation. Recently, there was information that the Russians had lists of all Ukrainian activists, Ukrainian politicians and intellectuals to be imprisoned or killed. So it's a matter of survival. And second thing, that it's not that decision of Ukraine to fight back that provoked Russia or whatever. The Russians have been provoking the West in Ukraine ever since Putin came to power. Even before that, when Ukraine was not aiming for the membership in NATO in 1993, 1994, Russia for the first time tried to annex Crimea. Fortunately, at that time they failed. Russia trying to reshape our borders in 2003 when there was a conflict over the island Tuzla. And the Russians were waging a different kind of war against Ukraine, cutting supplies of gas or waging trade wars with Ukraine. And this all based on the Primakov doctrine. Primakov is a guy, a KGB guy, who is a godfather of the terrorism in the Middle East, and he was actually a Russian neo-imperialist. And he said that Russia should conduct its independence foreign policy. Second, it should restore its supremacy over the post-Soviet space. Thirdly, it should oppose any expansion of NATO. Fifthly, it should wage China against the United States and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So he laid down the let's say ground for the new imperial conquest, and there was nothing to stop Putin, because he saw the window of opportunity because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan of the Americans, and they thought West is weak, they would not come to help Ukraine. That's why I should solve Ukrainian issue once and for all.
Right. Now, Alexander, tell me this. Where we are now, we have the leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, talking about the possibility of talks in the coming year. We've just heard the other day Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, talking about talks in the coming year. Do you consider some sort of discussion at the table is becoming inevitable in 2025?
Well, given Mr. Trump in White House and his willingness to stop this killing, as he called this genocidal war of Russia against Ukraine, certainly we have not a bright prospect of the United States being on our side. And certainly the United States are indispensable in this conflict, not just because of their economic and financial might, but because the Europeans are has been relaxed since 1991, and they are not capable of producing shells and other material that we need to fight Russians back. So that's why these possible scenarios of Trump exerting pressure of Ukraine are just pushing Mr. Zelensky to talk about possible talks with Russia. Even though I'm a former diplomat and don't believe there is no space to talk with Russians, not just because the Russians seems to be winning, even though it's not the case. They are just throwing a huge amount of people just to pretend that they're winning. But this war is not just about the bits of Ukrainian territory or Ukraine as a whole. It's about new security architecture in Europe. In 2021, Putin blackmailed Americans. He said that Americans need to pack their belongings and get out of Europe, and that the Central and Eastern European countries should be expelled from
Yeah.
NATO. So it's not just about Ukraine. That's why I'm hopeful that Mr. Trump will face this reality and then make a different kind of decisions that are expected in the Kremlin.
Okay, that is your hope, Alexander Kara. Thank you. Larisa Brown, our defense editor at The Times. One of the things that Volodymyr Zelensky said was he envisioned some sort of arrangement where maybe the battle lines of Ukraine were frozen. Russia, without being granted sovereignty or recognized sovereignty of Russian occupied territory, Ukraine will be on the other side of that line, but with a guarantee of its security from NATO. NATO may very well say no to such an arrangement, mightn't they?
I think they will. And actually, I asked someone about this today, somebody in the British military, and I think that the concerns with that idea is that what happens if Russia deliberately attacks those NATO troops that might be protecting the rest of Ukraine, or there's some miscalculation and they do it by accident, then what will NATO do next? And you could very quickly see a situation where you're escalating into a Third World War style scenario.